Thanks, Amanda. I long for the day I can walk up to a stage and not have to put the microphones down. That's what you get for being 5'6". Well, thank you for that warm welcome, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I grew up in the 1980s and 90s, and part of what that meant was that I grew up watching the original classic Superman movies, the really good ones with Christopher Reeve and Gene Hackman duking it out. There's one particular conversation and quote from those movies that always stuck out to me as a kid. It's when Superman says to his arch-nemesis Lex Luthor, "Luthor, the world is as it always was, on the brink, with good fighting evil." And I always liked that. I liked the simplicity of good and evil as a kid. You know, good, me and my people and what I stood for, and evil, those bad guys out there. But over time, I found what I'm sure most of you have found too, that fight between good and evil is much more complicated, much more messy, much more layered, and much more tricky than I thought it was. And in fact, much more beautiful as well. When I was just a few months old, my parents and I were living just a few kilometres south of Colombo's CBD in Sri Lanka. We are Sri Lankan Tamils, and as a result of that, we were caught up in some of the worst of Sri Lanka's civil war. That July for Sri Lankans came to be known as Black July, July 1983. And the reason for that was because death squads were sent out across Colombo and other parts of the country to find and torture and hurt and kill Tamil people. And one of these death squads broke into my parents' home. My dad grabbed me out of the cot. I was just 3 months old, and he ran me into the bathroom at the back where there was a small locking door with a tiny latch. And he locked it. My mum didn't make it in time, so she was stuck in the bedroom. And because of all the commotion and the screaming, me being 3 months old, I started crying. And that led some of the members of this death squad to the bathroom door where my father and I were hiding. And they started banging away. And they banged away at this door trying to get to us. And my parents were pretty helpless, as you can imagine. All they could do was pray. And so that's what they did. They prayed. And as the banging continued, somehow that tiny little latch held. It somehow did not give way. And so this gang left, and they said when they were leaving, "We're going to come back, we're going to burn down your house." So after they left, my parents stumbled out into the night and they hid in the bushes nearby. And it was pretty clear that we weren't going to make it if I was there crying and attracting attention. And so thankfully a neighbour, an employee of one of our neighbours actually came past and said, "Give your baby to us. The three of you aren't going to survive the night. At least we can take him and make sure he's okay." And so my parents gave me to this young lady, thinking that might be the last time they actually got to see me, and they spent the night hiding in these bushes. The gang came back, of course, and burnt down the house, and my folks had to just sit there and watch. There's nothing they could have done without risking their lives again. Watch all of their possessions just razed to the ground. But somehow, that night we all survived, all three of us. And the next day, in another miracle, one of my uncles went and found me, returned me to my parents. And then soon after that, we got word that there was this country called Australia a few thousand kilometres away that was willing to give us a second chance. What happened to my family and I, and happened to many, many thousands of Sri Lankan Tamils, I'm sad to say, both before and that month and since then as well. And so I just wanted to acknowledge them. Some of them are watching this on live stream. Many of them are my uncles and aunties and cousins. And I want to specifically acknowledge my parents too. Acknowledge their love and strength and faith and courage, not just for saving my life that night, but in the decades since. I certainly wouldn't be here speaking to you all and have had the life that I've had if not for them. Appa and Amma, and I'm eternally grateful to them. But I got to grow up in Australia, a beautiful country. I got second chances and third chances. I got much more than a fair go. But part of the problem is that I carried a lot of the bitterness and anger from what happened to my family and I as I grew up. And I was kind of wallowing in this victimhood for a long time, but knowing that it was destroying me, even as a young man, even as a teenager, I knew that at some point I'd have to find a way to get through this sense of anger and bitterness. And then thankfully some truths started to dawn on me. There's a Christian author called Frederick Buechner who says, out of all the sins, anger is probably the most fun. It's the most fun sin. And then he writes this, he says, "We smack our lips at the thought of grievances past and the possibility of bitter future confrontations. We savour the pain done to us and the pain we are going to dish out. In many ways, it's a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback of all of this is that the thing we are wolfing down is ourselves. The skeleton at the table is you. And that's exactly what I was doing. That's what was happening to me. And then another thing became clear to me. It wasn't just my bitterness at the people that had done injustice to me. It was actually my brokenness underneath that I was struggling with as well. So I needed a cure for my bitterness, and I also needed healing for my own brokenness and forgiveness myself. As the sons of Korah so beautifully sang just now out of Psalm 130, if God kept a record of sins, who could stand? I know that I certainly couldn't. And so I needed help. I needed help to do that thing that I just couldn't do in my own strength, that thing that the Yale theologian Miroslav Volf said was about including myself in the community of sinners and including my enemies and opponents in the community of humanity. And thankfully, over time, I found what I was looking for. I found it in the Christian message. I found it in the Christian faith. I found it specifically in one aspect of the Christian faith. This thing that C.S. Lewis, the great thinker and author, said was what separated Christianity from every other worldview out there, theistic or atheistic. And that thing is grace. This remarkable idea, this undeserved, unwarranted, unmerited, and unearned favour and love of God for people. Amazing grace. Most of us have heard the hymn. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Many of you will know that that was written by John Newton, who was a former slave trader and slave sea captain, who then repented and became a Christian and wrote Amazing Grace. And as I became a Christian, as a teenager, it became clear to me pretty quickly that just like John Newton, just like those men on the other side of the bathroom door that were trying to kill my father and I needed grace. I needed that same grace just like them. Shakespeare wrote that adversity is ugly and venomous like a toad, but holds a precious jewel in its head. The more I thought about it and looked back on my life, I'm pretty sure that that jewel that Shakespeare was writing about was grace, or something to do with grace. Because in my life, there have always been some constants, and you might recognize these in your life too. There's always been some adversity. There's always been some struggle and great adversity, but there's always been grace at work. Grace from above and grace from other people who have extended grace to me. And there's always been brokenness that I've had to navigate through and struggle with. That need for grace, I think, is a ubiquitous need. And I had so much of that in my life. I got to grow up in Melbourne first and then in Perth, in a happy and a stable home. And I acknowledge not everyone gets the blessings that I've had, but my story is a happy family, a happy childhood. And then I got to come to Canberra, I got to study law, got to practice law for a few years, came up here to Parliament, worked as a ministerial advisor for 8 years in government and then for a little bit in opposition. Then met and married my beautiful wife, Fiona. And we spent a couple of years in Oxford where I got to study, and then in Singapore for 5 years. And we just got back to Australia last year, where we now live in Sydney with our 3 kids, and I work with the Centre for Public Christianity. And I get what some of you might be thinking as I just kind of rattle off my whole life story in 20 seconds. It's a bit cliche, isn't it, this refugee story? This kind of from a war-torn developing country to the halls of Parliament to the University of Oxford. Haven't we heard this podcast and watched that movie and read that book before? And that's fair, you know. In many ways, us refugees and immigrants, we've kind of been just writing footnotes to Arne Doe's The Happiest Refugee. So I get that. I get that sentiment. But the reason I think my story is relevant is not because it's unique. It's because it's really astonishingly common. It's all of our stories. At the first principle level, all of our stories have great adversity and struggles that we are dealing with. All of our stories have things, grace in action, things that we can be grateful for. And all of us are navigating always a sense of brokenness in here and dealing with the brokenness and the bitterness out there. From the single mum who's courageously raising her kids in public housing, to the small business owner who's struggling with the uncertainty of turnover, to the millionaire investment banker who's struggling in his marriage, to the remote Indigenous community who's just trying to build a local economy to give their kids hope, to the member of parliament who might be kicking goals in the chambers and in the national media but just wishes they could see more of their family and their loved ones. We all need grace. Plato said, "Be kind because everyone you meet is fighting a difficult battle." And I think that's right. And that's why when we see those little moments of grace in action in everyday life, they resonate with the human heart because they're what we all need. I was on a bus earlier this year, just in Sydney, a regular commuter bus, and it just so happened that that day was that bus driver's first day on the job. And I don't know if he just slept through the training or skipped it, but he had no idea where he was going. Didn't know the route, didn't know the stops, had no idea. And it was refreshing to me to see all of us, and we all kind of knew each other because we catch the same bus every week. We all just stepped up and helped him. People came alongside him, we guided him, we said, yeah, this is where you need to stop, this is where you need to turn. We said, yeah, Bill is going to get on here, Stephanie's going to get off there. Those little moments of grace, they might seem like little things, but they're what hold our community together. Paul Keating called them the golden threads of our community. John Howard called it unvarying civility. They're talking about grace. I don't know what's going to happen in the US election tomorrow, but one thing I can promise you, in the days and weeks and months that follow, there's going to be a need for grace. They're all going to have an immense need for grace because we all have that need. And when we see it in action in everyday life, it's a beautiful thing. And that, for me, typifies the Australian fair go at its most beautiful. Because as I've experienced it, our fair go at its best is not fair. It's about second chances and third chances and fourth chances. It's about cutting each other slack, especially when we don't deserve it. And I saw it here when I worked at Parliament for those 8 years. Politics at its most beautiful is a place of grace too. And I'm so glad and honoured some of our members and senators are here because these are hard-working, dedicated people that get up every morning at crazy o'clock most mornings and give of themselves, sacrifice and give of themselves for a greater good, for something beyond themselves, so others can have a better quality of life. And then extend that same grace to those around them, to their colleagues, and even to those across the political aisle. That might be hard to believe, but I saw it when I worked up here. Sometimes it happens behind closed doors and it's never reported on, but that grace is alive and well here. Politics at its most beautiful can be a place of grace. But I concede that it's not easy, this thing called grace, showing one another grace. I had a near-death experience and then was able to find healing and forgiveness, and yet I still struggle when someone cuts in front of me in traffic or when I see an obnoxious social media post that I disagree with. We're not wired for it in our own strength, and the world doesn't optimize for it either. In fact, the algorithms that govern so much of our digital lives are designed to slice and dice us and herd us into our echo chambers. They're not designed for us to give one another grace. We so obviously and clearly need help from outside of ourselves. As was mentioned, if you were here at this event last year, right here, the Abdullahs stood, this incredible couple, and told the story of how they were able to forgive, to extend grace and forgiveness even to the man that was responsible for the deaths of 3 of their children. Amazing grace. And they were very upfront and clear that the only way that that was possible was because of the grace that they had received and found in their Christian faith. The same place that I found and continue to find grace too. The Christian message, this Christian idea of grace, is anchored in a God who stepped into the world as a person out of grace, who went to a cross and took on to himself all of the bitterness and anger and struggles and darkness of humankind out of grace. And then he loved the people who were killing him while they were killing him out of grace. Amazing grace. When my wife Fiona and I were trying to think of a name for our youngest child, just a few weeks before she was born, this is going back a few years now, we wanted, like all parents, the name to be meaningful. We didn't want it to be too weird. We wanted to say something about ourselves, and we wanted it to be the kind of name that she could identify with, to reflect the kind of person that we wanted her to be. And so we asked ourselves some questions. We asked ourselves what got us through adversity, what was it that we valued and found the most joy in, and what we knew we were going to need, and what we knew we were going to need reminders of in the future. And the answer to all of those questions was very, very easy. And so her name is Grace. Her name is Grace. So my friends, I think Superman had it half right. The world is as it always was, on the brink, with good fighting evil, but that fight is not as simple as we think. It doesn't just happen out there. It doesn't just happen in our parliamentary chambers back there. It doesn't just happen in our news headlines or on social media. It happens in here as well. As the Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, the line that divides good and evil cuts through every human heart. It certainly cuts through mine, and because of that, I'm in need of grace, and I'm pretty sure we are all in need of grace. My encouragement to you today is that that grace is available, that grace from beyond yourself, and that grace that you can then extend to those around you. Annie Johnson Flint was a poet who died, and when she died, she had crippling arthritis that plagued her entire body. But she found that grace that she needed in her Christian faith too. And before she died, she wrote this: He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labours increase. To added affliction, he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials, his multiplied peace. His love has no limits. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. My friends, my hope and prayer for all of you this day, these coming months, and in the years ahead as well, is that you will experience that grace from beyond yourself and be able to extend that to those around you. Because I am fully convinced, as the old hymn finishes, that it is grace that has brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. God bless you all.